Refusing new foods peaks right between ages 2 and 6, and it is almost always completely normal. But get this, about 5.9% of preschoolers in one screening study actually met the criteria for ARFID. So that 5.9% figure, it comes from a recent screening study of Swedish preschoolers. Now, if you're a parent sitting down to dinner tonight and you feel like you're literally heading into a daily battleground, just take a deep breath, okay? We are going to explore the vast spectrum of childhood eating today. And we're starting with the ultimate reassurance. Most food refusal is entirely, perfectly normal. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the picky eating phase, when it actually becomes ARFID, recognizing the red flags, and finally, what actually helps.
All right, let's start with part 1, the picky eating phase.
Let me just say right off the bat, if you've ever, negotiated with a toddler over eating a single piece of broccoli, you are absolutely not alone. Mealtime battles are incredibly common. They can be totally exhausting, but the good news is they're usually just a phase. Now, researchers make a subtle distinction here. We use these terms interchangeably all the time, but there is a difference. Food neophobia is specifically a reluctance to try new foods. Picky eating, on the other hand, is a bit broader. That's rejecting both familiar and new foods. But here's the crucial takeaway for you. Both of these sit firmly on the benign, age-appropriate end of the spectrum. Timing is everything here. These largely developmental behaviors usually peak right between the ages of 2 and 6. As kids assert their independence, which we all know they love to do, and their physical growth rate naturally slows down, their appetite just kind of changes. For the vast majority of kids, these intense aversions are totally temporary and will just naturally fade over time.
Which brings us to part 2, when it becomes ARFID.
So what happens when it doesn't fade? Well, that's when we move from a developmental time-limited phase to ARFID, which stands for Avoidant/Restricted Food Intake Disorder. Now, ARFID is a clinical feeding disorder. It's persistent, it's severe, and it is absolutely not just your child being stubborn. ARFID is generally driven by one or more of 3 core factors. First up, sensory sensitivity, meaning an extreme aversion to the smell, taste, or texture of a food. Literally, their brain processes it differently. Second is low appetite, or just a general lack of interest in eating. Or third, an intense fear of consequences. We're talking about a real phobia of choking or vomiting. And I want to be incredibly clear here. Unlike other eating disorders, ARFID is absolutely not driven by body image or a desire to change weight. Now, data from a major BMJ review completely shatters a massive misconception. You might assume ARFID only affects kids who look severely underweight, right? But the data actually shows ARFID happens across the entire weight spectrum. Many affected children are completely normal weight or even overweight. So you literally cannot diagnose the severity of a child's eating struggle simply by putting them on a scale. In fact, in that Swedish screening study of preschoolers we mentioned earlier, 65.2% of children met the ARFID criteria due to psychosocial impairment alone. No weight loss required. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means the primary impact of ARFID for these young kids is social and emotional. We're talking about severe mealtime distress, profound family conflict, or kids who literally can't go to a friend's birthday party because the food environment is just way too overwhelming for them. Let's look at part 3, recognizing the red flags. So as a parent, how do you know when you've crossed that line? Well, here are the core red flags to look out for. Noticeable growth or weight faltering, a very narrow, rigid range of accepted foods that just never expands, extreme distress that impacts their daily social life, or an intense fear of choking or vomiting that completely prevents eating. Now, I really need to emphasize something vital right here. This explainer is here to support everyday fussiness and provide education, but we cannot diagnose clinical ARFID. If you are seeing these persistent signs in your child, please use this as a clear off-ramp to consult a professional, a pediatrician, a dietitian, or a pediatric psychologist. Never, ever try to diagnose this on your own. There's also a really fascinating correlation researchers found in the Swedish data. Take a look at the failure rate for early language screens. It's 39.1% for kids with ARFID, compared to just 13.5% for those without. That means early neurodevelopmental difficulties, specifically delayed language, are significantly overrepresented in children with ARFID. It tells us that these feeding struggles can sometimes be deeply intertwined with how a child's brain is processing and interacting with the world. And while we've already established that many of these kids are at a normal weight, we absolutely cannot ignore the silent physical stakes. Persistent food avoidance can lead to severe physical complications entirely behind the scenes. We're talking about very real risks, like low bone mineral density or extreme vitamin deficiencies that can even lead to things like scurvy. Yes, scurvy. This is exactly why medical oversight is absolutely crucial, regardless of how healthy a child might look on the outside.
All right, on to our final section, Part 4, What Actually Helps?
Let's move into some actionable, evidence-based approaches for families navigating the tougher end of this eating spectrum. I absolutely love this quote from the qualitative research we looked at. It points out that a child's temperament and a parent's feeding practices have a bidirectional relationship. Basically, they feed off of each other. What this means is that the way we, as parents, react to food refusal is incredibly powerful in shaping the ultimate outcome. So, the most crucial starting point: avoid pressure to eat tactics. Look, it is so completely well-intentioned. You're worried about your kids' health, you want them to eat, so you bargain, you bribe, maybe you push a little. But the research explicitly shows that coercive, pressure-filled dynamics actually make food refusal worse. It essentially turns the dinner table into a high-stakes stress zone, and that completely kills whatever tiny bit of appetite or curiosity your child might have actually had. Now, if you are dealing with clinical ARFD, you're gonna need a team. Multidisciplinary care is key here. Frontline treatments include family-based therapy and CBT-AR. That's cognitive behavioral therapy specifically adapted for ARFD. There is some really strong emerging evidence for CBT-AR right now, especially for kids whose ARFD is driven by fear and sensory sensitivities. The goal is to have dietitians and psychologists working together to support the entire family. At the core of that clinical therapy is something called graduated food exposure. It safely mirrors step-by-step fear exposure. Notice that eating is actually step 4. First, a child just has to tolerate the food being present on the table. No pressure to touch it. Then, maybe they just smell it, or give it a little poke with a finger. Then eventually, a tiny taste. This whole process helps kids overcome profound aversions gradually, safely, and entirely without coercion. And that brings us to a really vital point. Taking a step back to create a responsive, low-pressure environment is the first and honestly most powerful thing you can do. It's how we transform mealtime from a battlefield back into a space for safe exploration. So whether your child is facing a completely normal phase or real clinical hurdles, how will you reshape your family's relationship with food tonight? Remember, Fear Me Not helps kids conquer fears through play.